Well, hello, folks out there in YouTube land. Got a big show lined up for you. Let's get right on into it. All right, Oklahoma and Texas are getting delayed until 2025. We're going to talk about that, what's causing it, also how this is going to affect the Vols going in the future. And needless to say, this is a lot about money, politics, and power.
Haven't you noticed? You got to be a man to play in my league.
That's right, JR knows. Now, this goes back a ways. This actually all got cut. The deal got cut in 2021 that Texas and Oklahoma were planning to leave the Big 12 and join the SEC, and everybody remembers that. But there's been a lot of talk that they might leave and come 1 year earlier in 2024. And a lot of people didn't think they'd stay because there'd be too much bad blood. And what you've got now, it says, is two testy blue blood universities, Texas and Oklahoma, and then a bunch of frustrated legacy Big 12 members who feel like they're sort of getting crapped on. And then on top of it, you've got two rival television networks, and that gets the money involved. And they've been negotiating like crazy on this, but they've run into snags of all kinds, most of which over television rights. And it says these things are difficult and complex. It says former commissioner, there's a lot of stakeholders, there's nothing easy about it. And they talked about how there was a lot of momentum, and all of us thought they were going to join in 2024. And the Big 12 commissioner opened the door for an early exit. Look, they're feeling jilted, and they're just like, just go, just leave. But there's way too much involved to do it that way. And even though the president of Oklahoma and Texas would love to leave early, and you've got four schools that are going to join the Big 12, which is Houston, Cincinnati, UCF, and BYU. And look, those aren't exactly big-time schools when it comes to notoriety. And you're trying to replace Texas and Oklahoma, which are, look, they're big dogs. So the Big 12, they're not feeling so good. It says the new member start date of July 2023 means the Longhorns and Sooners would compete against them for not just one season, but two. This didn't go over well in Austin and Norman. And there's definitely some bad blood between the conference, the commissioner, and the two teams. And it says, recent comment from Big 12 administrator, they want to go, we want them to go. And the big issue has to do with rights and TV contracts. Both are bound to the league through the end of 2024 with ESPN and Fox. And this is big money because if you leave early, there's an exit fee of 2 years, which is $80 million. So a lot of money's involved here. And what it boils down to is the Big 12 has agreements with Fox, and they get 4 games a year each from Texas and Oklahoma. And Fox would need to be compensated for the loss of those 8 games. And since Fox is the one that can get hurt financially, they're not going to want to let them go, and they're going to want what they call a pound of flesh.
I hate goodbyes.
So ESPN would have to work out some sort of trade in this deal because ESPN controls the SEC rights. And what it boils down to is that Fox would want a bunch of games in return. And they'd have to trade out some Michigan, Ohio State games, et cetera. It's just, look, when you start getting into these type of big type deals, everybody wants to win. So Fox wants to win, ESPN wants to win, and they don't like each other. That's the other issue, is that when you're negotiating and you've got two big giant companies that strongly dislike each other, it can get ugly real quick. So it looks to me like Texas and Oklahoma are not going to make it in 2024.
I was unavoidably detained.
That's right, unavoidably detained. And now we're going to talk about how this affects the Vols, because that's what we really care about anyway. So let's get into that. And it talks about how most people are thinking now that they're not going to join the SEC until 2025. Now, this talks about how Arch Manning may never wind up in Neyland Stadium against Nico and all that. And some people are thinking about that, but I'm talking about, how it's going to affect every game moving forward. But I'm way more concerned about how it's going to affect the schedule, because they're talking about moving from 8 games to 9, and then you have 3 permanent teams that you'll end up playing against, and then you'll flip-flop each year. So you'll play 6 teams and then 6 teams. So you'll end up playing everybody in the conference every 2 years, and 3 of which you'll play every year. And I think what we're going to wind up with is permanent opponents in Alabama, Kentucky, and Vanderbilt. That's probably where we're going to wind up, if I had to guess, and that's what most people think. Now, it is possible we could wind up seeing Nico versus Texas Arch Manning, but it's probably 50-50 at this point, because it would be their 3rd year in 2025, and so you've got a 50-50 chance they'd even play each other. Also, we'd be losing Florida and Georgia as an every year opponent if we wind up with those 3 permanent opponents I just discussed with a 9-game conference schedule. So realize if you're in the SEC, now you've got to play 9 SEC teams, not 8. So that makes a big difference, which means we're probably going to be playing a weaker team as opposed to, usually we'll play like a Pittsburgh or an Oklahoma, for example. We've played them some, or North Carolina, or some good school that gives us a good game. We're probably going to wind up with some easy games, getting rid of a big-time school and putting in another, Ball State or Murray State or one of those state teams. And you'll have no divisions, and you'll wind up with the top 2 teams playing at the end of the year for the conference championship. And if you don't think that's a big impact, Tennessee would have played Georgia in the SEC championship game because they beat Alabama and LSU head-to-head. So they would have won the 6-2 tiebreak. So we would have played Georgia in Atlanta in the SEC championship game if we were using this new format. So it makes a big difference when you take the top 2 teams instead of the East versus the West. But Florida would be a rotating opponent most likely. And here it talks about Vanderbilt, Alabama, and one other school, perhaps Kentucky likely would be the Vols' permanent opponents. And we'd only play Florida every other year. Also means we probably won't be playing Oklahoma for a few years, which would have been, man, you talking about ESPN Game Day showing up for something? Heupel versus Oklahoma? Yeah, they'll be there for that. You can just count on it. And it talks about how the Tennessee-Oklahoma game could be how do you like me now, homecoming for Heupel, because Heupel's had a lot of success and Oklahoma has struggled since their coach left them. And we actually were lined up to play Oklahoma in 2024, but the SEC directed Tennessee to cancel that game in anticipation that Oklahoma would be joining the league because you wouldn't want to play them twice or have 10 SEC games. And here it talks about the SEC will drop divisions when Texas and Oklahoma expand the league to 16. And it talks about Tennessee, to get to the SEC championship game, has to go through Georgia, which that's tough, man. Georgia's been tough the last few years. So it looks like everything's going to pretty much stay the same for another couple of seasons. And then in 2025, everything's going to change. And I think that probably makes sense as far as permanent opponents for Tennessee, which again would be Alabama, Kentucky, and Vanderbilt. First of all, you're going to play your in-state opponent, which is Vanderbilt for us, which is actually good for us because Vanderbilt's usually a pretty easy win. But sticking with Alabama because we played them so long is probably going to happen. And look, Alabama's not going to be number 1 or number 2 forever. At some point, Nick Saban's going to have to retire. And I'm questioning his new move. If you'll notice, he did hire Kevin Steele, which I covered yesterday, and Tommy Rees. So he's moving to run the ball, play hard defense. He's moving back to the future about 10 or 15 years and trying to emulate what Georgia's been doing with Kirby Smart, because I just think that's more comfortable for him, and he's seeing Georgia having success with it. Now, realize, maybe that's why he worked so hard in recruiting this year and got all those 5 stars, because he knows to play that sort of offense and defense, you've got to have better athletes at almost every position because you're limiting how many points you're going to score. You're not going to score 50 points in that type of offense running the ball. So he's limiting himself to probably 35, somewhere in that neighborhood, and then trying to play big-time defense and keep everybody under 20, which is what Alabama used to do. Now, it's going to be hard to do with all the changes in the offensive rules because the offense gets all the advantages as far as all NCAA rules, and it's going to continue to move that way. Now, realize Nick Saban would not have moved to this newfangled offense that he did when he hired Lane Kiffin had he been able to keep offenses from moving fast. If you remember, he fought like crazy with the NCAA trying to slow down offenses and not letting them snap the ball unless there's 29 seconds on the clock and all of that. But when he realized that wasn't going to go and they were not going to side with him, that's when he decided, okay, I better hire Lane Kiffin or somebody like him. And I think that had to do a lot with Gus Malzahn having success against him with their run-pass option. I actually really liked that offense. Auburn was fun to watch when Gus was there. And I don't really understand why they fired him. He was very successful at Auburn, and he almost won a national title, probably should have. But Auburn, they suffer from that little brother syndrome. And with Alabama having all that success and them winning, 8 games, that just wasn't getting it done for them. So, they let Gus go and then brought in Brian Harsin. Now, that didn't work out so good. And on a basketball note, we got moved from number 2 to number 6 because obviously we lost that game against Florida and then barely beat Auburn. And we just didn't look good in either game. So I'm not surprised that we dropped from number 2 to number 6. That's, probably about right now. And we'll see what happens. You know, they got to start putting that ball in the hole at some point. All right, folks, just wanted to cover the Oklahoma-Texas SEC delay and how that would affect the Vols. And look, it's all about the money and the Benjamins. That's what it's about.
Jerry, you better yell! Show me the money!
That's right. Fox News wants somebody to show them the money. And if they don't get it, they're going to block this. And I think they've pretty much already decided to do that. It's way too complicated at this point. The further it goes along, the longer it's delayed, the less likely it is to happen. So I'd say we can look for those two teams to join in 2025. And if you like this content, be sure to hit that like button. Lets me know to continue to cover the Vols, the SEC, and all the goings on. And if you've not subscribed, it's right here on the left. Be sure to hit that little button right there. Costs you nothing, helps me out. I would appreciate it. Some of you watch my channel and you don't hit that little button. Just do it. And right over here, YouTube puts my most recent video. Pretty popular. Be sure to check that out. And we'll see you next time on Sports Talk Jay.